I don't see the green one. That was a beautiful song. The song I'm going to sing today, I've sung it before, and its words are just simple, and I think we all remember singing This Little Light of Mine if you were in church as a small child. Easter season is just a very special time. You start to believe and know that God is in us. He made a way for us through Jesus, that we're all born with this light inside us, but it's not shining yet until we come to know him. And then he's got a job for us to do in our lives to shine the light for him. And all through the situations in your life, you are that light, and you are the church, wherever you are. You're the group you're around, the people you're with. You're like the little church with your light shining. So that's what this song's about, kind of going through your life from birth, our little grandbaby, all the way up till the oldest one here today. And just let your light shine. There's a little flame inside us all. Some shine bright, some shine small. The rains will come and the waters rise, but don't you ever lose your light. In this life you will know love and joy, pain and sorrow. So when it hurts, times get hard, don't forget whose child you are. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, gonna let it shine. May you live each day with no regret. Make the most of every chance you get. May your eyes get wide when you look at the stars, with the same sense of wonder as a child's heart. With the ones you love, treasure the time. And for those who are gone, keep their memory alive. Hold on to your dreams, don't ever let go. There's a fire inside you, burning with hope. So this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, gonna let it shine. There will be days when you wanna give up, when the storm settles in. But after the rain comes the sun, so don't you ever forget. Oh, don't forget, the sun will shine again. You see, one day there will be no more pain, and we will finally see Jesus' face. So until then, I'm gonna try to love this world and let my little light shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little. Okay, let it shine. Gonna let it shine, gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine. Oh, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, gonna let it shine. Oh, let it shine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of, I know you know it. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Amen.
Thank you, Julia. This must be mother-in-law day because that's my son's mother-in-law. And I'm going to invite my mother-in-law to come up. Stan, do you have the green mic? I knew you did, you dirty rascal.
Good morning. I'm so glad we're here with family. God's asked me to do many things, but this is one of the hardest. I want to share just a verse before I share about garments of praise. It's in Isaiah, and I've read it many times, but it really expresses what's in my heart. I am overwhelmed. I have the New Living Translation. I am overwhelmed with joy in the Lord my God, for he has dressed me with the clothing of salvation and draped me with the robe of righteousness. What Jesus has done for us is overwhelming. It's overwhelming joy. Can I just move? Can I maybe just have a chair up here so I can? When I was complaining to him because I was just an old lady. Why did he expect me to do all those things? He just said, if I can use a donkey, I can use you. And I was just thinking, and Julie helped me remember the third one. A donkey was available. The donkey was willing, and the donkey was obedient. And Jesus rode in on a donkey, so I'm with good company. Yeah. So I want to share with you what God has been doing with us in Garments of Praise. It's because it's truly about God's faithfulness. You can dim the lights a little if you want. Turn them off. God uses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. Slide 2. Because we said yes to God, he gave us the plan to bring hope to the helpless, the oil of joy to those who mourn, and to preach the good news to the poor, and exchange the spirit of heaviness with the garments of praise, and that God would be glorified. Next slide. We went wherever God led us. Sometimes we were in a church, sometimes we weren't. Next. Sometimes under a tree, but wherever we went, it was to share God's great good news. Next slide. In 2005 and 2007, God allowed us to visit 22 different churches and share with them. Then God burdened our hearts. Next slide. Pastor Sammy and his wife Wage were pastors of the Ethiopian Refugee Church. And it was really them and their people that God used to burden our hearts to go to Kenya to see if we could help the refugees. I'd never seen deadness in people's eyes before, but that's what I saw there. And God wouldn't let me bring it and forget it because he had a plan for us. to use. Next slide. Next slide. And that plan was job skills training, because many of them had fled from their countries and they didn't know their job skills. Some of them, I had one little girl that was actually, from the time she was 5 till the time she was 17 when she came to us, she said her bed was grass, because her father was a rebel against the communist country in Ethiopia, and they had burned the house, and after several years on the run, they found them and killed her father and that, and she and her mother and sisters fled into the forests, and they just lived however they could until she escaped into Kenya. Next slide. Matika was one of the first refugees that we trained. We just found ways to send funds down. She had met and married a godly man in Kenya, but they were destitute because she had no skills and he was a pastor. And you know, pastors don't get paid very much. Not here anyway, but God will reward. But we taught her how to do hair, and it just changed her whole life, her whole outlook on life. And God blessed. Next slide. This is Kusha and Rachel, and God gave us, I mean, really, God just moves in such awesome ways, ways that we sometimes think are foolish, but somebody gave me a bunch of jewelry, and then God connected me through divine appointments with a lady that would teach the girls there how to make beads and jewelry out of paper. And those are all made from paper. And Kusha, on the left, had escaped into Kenya because her father had threatened to kill her because someone was sharing Jesus with her. And she was just 16 when she came. After she got into Kenya, she got to a church, and she was found Christ. She said, I loved Jesus before I ever really knew him. And then she, when she was saved, then her father put out a contract on her life. And she's now lives in Tucson, where I am. And this was just such a blessing. Next slide. We then started a tailoring school for both Ethiopians and Kenyans. We started in a rented room and with rented machines, and we started with 5 students. But God blessed us. Next slide. We soon grew. This is Asunta. I just want to share just a few stories of the many, many that God has let us help. But she was desperate. She was married. Her husband was mentally deranged. He would beat her and the children. He would sometimes lock them in the little room that was their house. Sometimes he would lock them out of it. But she had no skills, and she was only 18. And so she came to us, and we put her through the tailoring school, and she now has an extremely successful business. She's a wonderful dressmaker. Next slide. Because we found out, we started the school in 2010, but we learned that a lot of the students were not alert, and some of them would even go to sleep because maybe they only had the one young man, he only got 1 meal a day, and that was a small meal in the evening. And he had to walk a mile to come to tailoring school, and more than once I found him asleep on the cutting table because he was just so malnourished. He was actually 17, but I thought he was 12. And so we started our feeding program to give them 2 meals a day, a hot cup of porridge in the morning, and then a more substantial meal at 1. And parents were then willing to let their children come to the school because they didn't have to feed them. Down there, when the girls reach 13, 14, if there are younger children, they either have to go out and basically become a slave to somebody else or be sold. They call it a dowry, but I call it selling, to an older man because they can pay the highest. But because we fed them, they were willing to let them sleep at home and come to school. And God blessed us. We've, next slide. Next slide. We have seen over 100 graduate from our 2-year government-approved tailoring and dressmaking school. And I'm sorry, I lost my place. I'm just gonna. You cannot imagine the changes in life. Next slide. And the improvement in our tailoring school. God is just so faithful to meet us where we are and to provide for us. The young lady on your right is Esther, and this year, the graduate of 2018, she took top marks of every graduate from tailoring school in that whole area. And we were just very proud of her. Next slide. We've also helped many young men and some women go to Bible school. Paul on the right was our first young man that we sponsored into, and he is now a very well-established pastor in churches there in Kenya. And on the left is Goji, and he is now back in Ethiopia. He has started 16 different churches, and he wants to start a Bible school and help other pastors become trained. Next slide. Verdika on the left was an Ethiopian refugee who was arrested and accused of crimes by the communist regime there. They beat him, and he was imprisoned for 2 years, and his only bed was a cement floor. And because of it, he became very crippled in one leg, and he just walks very crippled, and he didn't think he was able. They finally threw him out because he was so crippled. They said, "You can never do anything." And he got people to help him escape to Kenya. He slept on the streets. When we found him, he had found a little hut. He was sleeping on rags in just on the dirt floor. God helped us to, first we had to help him learn English because all of the lessons there are taught in English. And he didn't even know Swahili or any of the native Kenyan languages. So it took him 3 years to learn English, and this past September, he graduated from heavy equipment operator because the levers are mainly with your hands, and his good leg he can use where he needs it. Felix on the right was an orphan. Both of his parents died with AIDS, and he was being cared for by his aged grandmother, and she could not afford to help him go to school. If you don't get education, your life is pretty hopeless in Kenya, because all you have to look forward to is just like being a general laborer and hard jobs that pay very, very little. But we helped him to finish high school. His grades were good enough that he could go on to chef school, and he's now has a full-time job and is cooking for a Christian school. And he has made a vow that as God prospers him, he will reach back and help someone else. That's what I ask of all those that we are helping. Next slide. Shalom Learning Center, God, we joined them in 2011. These children, these are happy, healthy children. But when we first joined with them, the school was going way down because they didn't have food. It's almost impossible for us to imagine the anxiety that a young child, 5, 6, feels when they know there's no food. Stephen had taken in one. Stephen Mao is the one who started the school and the one who operates it. But he had taken in a little boy that had been abandoned. And even though he fed him and everything, the little child couldn't sleep at night. He was 7 years old. And he just would keep waking up and crying and waking up and crying. And after 2 or 3 nights, Stephen just felt like God gave him wisdom. And he handed him a bun to take to bed at night so he could hold it in his hand. And he slept from then on because he had food in his hand. It's just beyond our understanding. Next slide. We also started because the students were not coming to school because they were afraid what little food at home would be gone when they got home. We came alongside them and we do the hot porridge. It looks brown because that's what the water is. And then the 2 little boys on the left, we fix a special Christmas dinner for them. But they are so thankful for the food that we have. Next slide. God also helped us be able to meet the needs. Peter on the top, on the left, Stephen noticed that he was getting closer and closer to the blackboard, because over there they don't even have school books. The teacher has to write the lessons on the board. The kids have to take their little notebook and copy the lesson and then work it. But he was just getting closer and closer to the board until finally he was like within 5, 6 inches of the board trying to read it, to write it down. And when we finally got him to the doctor said if we had not gotten him there, he would have been totally blind in the next 6 months. Peter, the one on the right, was they have motorcycle taxis and that, and he was being taken somewhere, and there was an accident, and he was injured. And when I first became aware of him, he had been bedfast for 6 weeks. And again, with just so little. You would just be amazed at how so little makes such a big difference. But he is now graduated from high school and gets around and is very healthy. Esther in the middle there on the bottom, her ears from the time she was a child ran all the time and she couldn't hear. And the doctors had to actually remove her ear and work on the inner part of her ear and sew her ear back on. But now she also has good hearing and is able to go on. Brian on the far was 8, but he looked like a 5-year-old because his teeth were decayed and abscessed. And for just less than $100, we were able to get him up, and he's now very healthy. Next slide. I just love these children. We presently have about 100, but it's just such joy to see their happy little faces and hear them sing. Next slide. This is their playground. You can see the blue on the side. It's dirt. And it isn't even nearly, it's about half or about a third of the church. And with the children that are there. And so God has enabled us to purchase land, and that's there on the left. You see the children going down the land to the land to thank God for it. And we will have a large place and grass for them to play on. Next slide. Equipping the saints came about because we realized that pastors and church leaders, many of them do not even have formal education. Some of them do not even have Bibles. It sounds hard to believe, but when you get saved and you see a great need, you just start telling people, and before you know it, you have people coming. And so God laid on our hearts, next slide, to start our first one. We had 19 in attendance, and over the years, this is the Ethiopian church on the right, and our group in Tala on the left. Next slide. God has blessed. We added Sunday school teacher training. We bound booklets that had like a year's worth of Sunday school lessons in them to take down because they had no materials. And basically the pastors that come down are very qualified, and the pastors there feel, I mean, it's just like them going to seminary in the lessons that they're taught. Last year, God blessed us with 275 in attendance. Next slide. After the conference was over, a delegation of 3 pastors came to basically beg me to please come and share with their group of pastors in a different place of 100. They wanted me to come and see that there was a need and that there was a large group. And so we are going to be going to their group also this next year, God willing. Next slide. Our Jesus Cares project came about because our budget was just so assigned. I just asked God, please give us something. We have people that come to us, they don't have $1 for medicine. They have malaria. People die there that would be nothing to be saved here. This last time that I just returned, there were 4 members of my little staff who had someone die in their family. One was just a 22-year-old girl. She had growths in her womb, but her parents could not afford the surgery, and so she just died. Next slide. We also, one of the pastors said, could you provide us with a soccer ball? Our boys come to church and they just don't have anything to do, and so we gave them a soccer ball, and we got a soccer team. We have had at least 20 young men that have been saved. We now have a junior team. We have a young man, or well, he's relatively young man. He's just in his 40s. He is helping, and he's committed to these boys in the little town of Katwana. Next slide. This, on the right, God helped us to hold I don't know what you call it, a thing on drug addiction. And out of this, God had people saved, and one of the worst drunkards in the whole village of Katwanya accepted Christ, and he felt burdened to start this Bridge of Hope, and 16 men have been saved, and we've given out many Bibles. We hold Bible studies there. The children would come by on Sundays when they don't have school, and so we had to get a teacher for them, and we have anywhere from 50 to 60 kids that would come on Sunday to hear about God. Next slide. Then God got us into the house building business. Moses and his wife on the right was one of the most, not the most, but one of the most pathetic things that I'd ever seen. When we first met them, their little hut that you can see there with the leaves in the background on the left was infested with jiggers. They had lesions on their feet. They didn't even have shoes to wear. Their clothing and their bedding was infested with jiggers. Jiggers are just a tiny, tiny little, I don't know what you call it, but anyway, they embed themselves in the skin. And we had to take all of their bedding and all of their clothes and burn them and then spray the whole compound. But this year, God enabled us to build a two-story house, or a two-room house. Not a two-story, that would be great. Next slide. This is Eunice. During the last rains of last June, it was very heavy, and her house literally collapsed. Her husband left her with 2 young boys. He went someplace else in Kenya, and she hasn't heard from him in about 4 years. And so it's up to her to go dig in people's gardens, do people's laundry, collect firewood, whatever she can do to feed her boys. So when her house collapsed, it was totally beyond her means. Next slide. So we built her a very sturdy 2-room house, and she is so thankful. Next slide. Last year, someone donated a Jesus film pack. And we have been taking it into just villages, market squares, and into schools. The schools allow you to come in and share the gospel with them. I don't know, but most of their schools run 800 to 1,000 students. And so when we go in, this happens to be a middle school, which is like 6th, 7th, 8th graders, and many received Christ. And then we have a little booklet of John and the book of Romans that we give them, and then we have follow-up with them. Next slide. Special projects. I was sitting in my living room with 3 Kenya pastors, and I got a phone call from a pastor in Arizona, and he said, "Ilowee, I'm at the bank, and I have $20,000 for you to drill a well." And I went, "What?" You know, and he said, I have $20,000. Someone gave me $20,000 to drill a well. I hung up the phone and I turned to the pastors and I said, "I guess we're drilling a well." And so we went and started investigating what it would cost. And because we knew the village that we wanted to drill for, it was the village of Katwanya, where God had burdened me for this village like 4 or 5 years ago. And next slide, you can show it. Water is one of the major causes of death in Kenya. You can see them gathering there on the lower left with the livestock in the background. And that's where she's taking her water. On the right is from the dam that the livestock are in. The 2 women up on the top, they have dug a hole and they wait. It took them all day to gather just 20 liters each of water. They'd have to wait till the water seeped it, and then they had a little wooden spoon that they would scoop it out and put it in. And then they have to carry it, sometimes up to 4 miles back home. Each one of 20 liters weighs 40 pounds. And it is the women and the children that do it. Many have become disabled because of the weight. So having a well, the little village of Katwanya and the surrounding area has about 2,000 people. Next slide. God enabled us to, I didn't finish my story. As we investigated and found out, it was just $20,000 to drill a borehole because we had to go down through 2 layers of rocks. And so it was going to be almost double, $38,000. And I just said, well, that's your problem, God. You're the banker. And that evening, a lady emailed me and said, Ilowee, do you need a well? I hadn't told anybody about a well. I had not, in my conversations, I was not aware of anything to do with a well. I knew that I didn't have the capabilities. But God, within 6 months of that phone call, had given us all the funds that we needed to drill that well and to run almost a mile's worth of water lines to 3 different kiosks so they didn't have to carry it so long. You see the little boy on the lower left? When those are full, that's 80 pounds plus the wheelbarrow. And he is probably 6 or 7 years old. That might be fine if it was flat ground. They don't have flat ground. It's uphill, it's rutted. It took him several hours to get that water back home, but that was his job. You can see that the people are lined up there because they're so great. God blessed us because I found out after I'd signed this agreement for $38,000 that the government had attempted to drill 2 wells in this village, and they had both failed. And at first my heart stopped, and I said, nope, God, I didn't say I was going to drill a well. You said we needed a well. And so God not only gave us everything we needed, the water was perfect. There was no contaminants. There was no hardness of water. Next slide. This is just on the lower right there. You'll see this little boy was coming to fill his bottle with water. It was filthy. That's another thing that we do. We train them in how to store water because they will just bring containers because they're used to dirty water. And we teach them hygiene. We teach them a proper way to do it. We had the dedication of the well on the upper right, and it was just a very joyous day. That was 4 years ago. God has kept that well going. It has not run dry. And pray for Kenya because right now they are experiencing the beginnings of a drought. Some places it's very, very bad. Next slide. That's what you see every morning and in the evening at the 3 kiosks that we have in that village. Next slide. It took us 2 weeks shy of 2 years from the time we made the down payment on this property till we got our title deed. And we could not do anything on the land until we got the title deed. But God honored us just before I left, 4 or 5 days before I left in February. We were able to receive our title deed. Next slide. First thing we did, the gal who keeps the books for us, she said when we were praying for the first well, she said, I'm going to say wells because I think God's going to allow us to do more than one. And I told God we couldn't do so many things, and he just blew me off. Praise God. But we brought the big welling rig in, or the big drilling rig in. And next slide. This is a video. I want you to show how God answered our prayers. Can you push the video? Did it not show up? Okay. Well, use your imaginations, everybody. As they drilled, the water started coming up, and then it shot up in the air about 100 foot. And everybody was just clapping and praising God because of what he had done for us. Next slide. There was an abundance of water, and we moved forward to the next step. Next slide. God, you know, I'm not going to be going down there forever. So God has brought along two young men, Joseph and Stephen, and I call them my right hand and my left hand. And each year they become more and more skilled. Joseph handles all of the government issues, the payroll, the insurance, just everything to do. And Stephen runs the Shalom School and does a lot of our photographs and IT work that I need done. But pray, I would appreciate if you would think of them, if you would pray for them, because it is a huge responsibility. Joseph, I told him, I know that when you started working for us, you never thought that you would be a banker, businessman, and now this year a builder. But he has learned all of these skills. You have to watch what you buy, the sand, that you don't get sand that they have added dirt to make it weigh more. Just so many things that you have to be careful of. But I praise God for what he is doing. Next slide. Because truly, everything that we have accomplished, Lord, you have done for us. It's wonderful to be a partner with God. He's a big partner and a good partner. Next slide. I just want to say thank you to this church because what could I do? What could I do? I'm a donkey. But God has brought along, God has touched people's heart. It was in 2013, the end, Will had gone home because he could no longer go. And God just said, you keep telling the people that I am their provider. So what are you doing asking people for money? How do you answer that one? You know, you have to do what you say. And so I made a covenant with God that we would never ask for money. Present the needs, but look, God knows who he wants. There are other people that are in need. And my fear is I never want to take or have people give to us when God has them helping someone else. And so our prayer is to God as our provider that he would meet our needs. And meet our needs he has. The first month that we did that, we had the lowest income, and I went, no, God, you said this, and somehow he stretched it to meet all the needs, and he has done exceedingly abundantly, and everything. We don't keep money around unless it's designated for something special, like the building program. On the land, we are going to be building, we have enough funds, I think, to build the first floor so that we can move the school out of their dirt floor, no window classrooms into bright, large classrooms with a good grass to play on in that. And so God is moving ahead, and I praise him for it. Thank you. Thank you for